because we're here in Costa Rica. So welcome everyone online and welcome everyone here. Thanks for joining the Fair Mapping Working Group session. Again, as I mentioned, we are not yet endorsed, but we're working on it. But still, we wanted to have a bit of a feather session to actually discuss and interact with all the people we had the chance to work with already in setting up the charter, and then move forward with the discussion. Although we are not yet endorsed, we can already start doing some work together, at least to prepare for the real work in the working group. So the idea of this session doesn't work. Yeah. So the idea of the session is Eunice and myself are going to talk a lot. We chose to do that because we wanted to discuss with you and explain you, and I think we were the best person to do that, what we're doing in Fair Impact, where we had in Fair Court for IOSC as well, what we have done with the charter, and we would like to discuss with you the charter in case we would like to change things. As we're still under TAB review, there's still time to make some changes and update. We wanted also to present you what are the reviews we already received from the TAB and things we are planning to change. And the main part is to actually, of course, give you an update of the recommendations on fair mapping and so on, but it's to start having a discussion about the first step of the working group, which is trying to collect as many use cases as possible, like real concrete use cases already implementing mappings and needing some help in making them fair, right? And we would like to start working on getting a structure to actually harmonize the description of these use cases, because at some point, we would like to create a knowledge base to actually share that information for communities that are starting the mapping process so that it can be a useful resource for them, right? And in the meantime, we want to collect the necessary information that we can use internally to actually do the work that we plan. We're going to show you very quickly where do we start this use case collection. We already had two short working group meetings discussing that. We also want to talk about the process. So Eunice and myself are going to present that. And the idea is that we have then an open discussion on the use case, the charter, and things you think we need to change, improve, even in the organization of the operational organization of the work we need to do in the working group. We're open for suggestions. And then we'll have a concluding slide showing you explaining you the next steps. So I will stop here and I will leave the floor to Eunice to present the charter and where we stand.
Yes, hello everybody. So I will be kind of like recapping a little bit what we've been doing for the past couple of months. As Jan mentioned, the case statement that is available under that behind that link. You can check it out. And thanks for everybody who has been contributing to the discussions or the actual text. So we got the TAP review results back, and I will be showing or giving you a summary of the revisions that we're going to make, and we can also discuss them a little bit whether they make sense to you. But just to recap a little bit what we've been doing before this point. So the first Birds of Weather was a year ago in P22. And I think that was a success. So there was a lot of people there. And that was a nice kind of like a kickstart for the work towards the working group. And we have, as Jan said, had 2 working meetings under the working group, unofficial working group. And now this is kind of like the kickoff point for the actual working group work. So the TAP review is available. You can check it out. The details there are. I would say in summary, there wasn't any huge or any fatal changes that we need to do, but some suggestions and smaller and bigger. So I'm gonna show or present a couple of the bigger changes that we're going to make. So first of all, related to the work plan. So we have described the kind of work that we're going to do and how it's going to be phased out, but it's just a wall of text. So we're going to add a visualization that I'm going to show you for commenting right soon. And then also we have, because mappings are very cross work group topic. So we have listed in the charter a lot of working groups that we are going to be engaging with, but TAP also wanted maybe a more, or again, easier to read list of things. So what exactly about the outputs of the work of those working groups is of interest to the fair mapping working group. So that's another addition that we're going to be making. And then the elephant, maybe not the elephant, but the sloth in the room is the global engagement. So right now we only have, so myself and Jan are co-chairing or are to be co-chairing the working group. We are both from Europe, so we're looking for co-chairs from everywhere else, basically. So this is a call out for everybody online here and your connections everywhere. So if you are interested in fair mappings, let us know, and especially, of course, then join the group. But especially if you are more than interested, you can suggest yourself as a co-chair. So this was a piece of advertisement about that. But the nice thing was that this kind of like lack of global, or the lack of further away. Yep. Sorry. Yeah, the lack of global reach in the co-chairs did not seem to be an issue that would prevent the working group from starting. So just to kind of like as a reminder, go back to the motivation of the working group. So why fair mappings working group? Because there are a lot of mappings out there, but they can be hard to find because because there's no metadata, or there are no registries, or there might be metadata, but it's could be all over the place. And then the reuse might be difficult because there might be there are in multiple different formats, and they can be scattered across the version control systems. A lot of the mappings are in PDFs or some other text formats or code or some kind of configurations. And they're not expressed in formats that can be or are meant for automated processing. At least they're not meant for automated processing in a harmonized way. And also, and so you probably come across this too, but I will show you some examples of the kind of difficulties that you might have when discussing about mappings. People use the word in a very different way, and that's of course okay. But one of the goals of the working group is to come up with a vocabulary for talking about mappings in a very precise way when you need to talk about in a precise way. So if you want to, for example, compare if the mapping work that you're doing is the same or similar to some other mapping related work. So here are the planned outputs. There's a lot of them, but the first three actually, so the technical recommendations to make fair mappings and fairness evaluation grid, and also the practical framework and guidelines about how to make great mappings or fair mappings. These are the outputs, basically the outputs of the fair impact project. And the idea is that's kind of like the first version, and through the global community of the RDA and the working group, those outputs will then be refined throughout the work of the working group, and there will be new versions and better versions. Of course, the first one would be okay, but then there's always room for improvement. So basically, we have something to start to work on. So this is not something that we're building from scratch in the working group. And then, in order to get some kind of grasp about what kind of mappings people are and organizations are doing, we start with the use case collection that also Jan mentioned. And the idea is to have some kind of structured and harmonized use case collection. We will go into this more detail later. So this is basically the topic of this session. And based on that would be kind of form the foundation of the work that we are doing, and foundation for all the other outputs basically. So the second one is related to this disambiguation of mapping talk or mapping related activities. So the aim is to create a mapping classification or even ontology that reuses existing work and also has this kind of holistic way or holistic view to the mapping activities. And then related to this exchange of mappings and the description of mappings and their metadata, the idea is to basically extend what SESOM has been doing to the different kinds of mappings out there, so that we would have a way to describe and exchange those mappings or different kinds of mappings between systems in an automated way. And all these outputs will be gathered and put together and linked together in what we've been calling a knowledge base. What it is in the end is still unknown. It will probably be something simple at start, but I'm hoping that in the end it would be something that can be maintained also after the working group, because this is a living field. So that would be then the kind of like the outputs of outputs that we will have. So, and then to the timeline. So I don't know, hopefully you can see it. So this is now the visualization of the activities that we have planned. The timeline or the months and years in the middle there are already wrong. So we are going to be pushing it back, and it will start basically from when the working group will be endorsed. So, but we've been doing all of what we're doing is kind of like this preliminary work, and I'm using the actual. And the reason why it needs to be pushed back is that I'm using the actual dates there, because I don't like the month 10, month 11 type of demarcation, because I can't wrap my head around that. So there are 3 phases. So we're now basically what we've been calling foundation building phase. And then the second phase is consolidation, and finally the finalization of the outputs. So in the foundation phase, the activities are focused on the collection of use cases. So as I said, kind of building the knowledge about what is out there, and then also the start of this ontology or classification definition. And the P23 and P24 are there kind of like as good places for presenting milestones. And there's a color coding there that well, you don't maybe not put so much weight to the version numbers there, but the idea is that there would be these places where substantial versions of those outputs from the different tasks would be published. And some of the tasks are something that would continually produce content, for example, the use case collection, but we could still have kind of like snapshots of that. And some of the things are more based on a more fixed publication or versioning idea. So, for example, the ontology or the exchange format. There's also the Fair Impact and Fair Core for EOS project depicted here, because both of those will provide valuable input to the working group. And unfortunately, as the longer it takes us to get the working group actually starting, and this is one of the reasons why we started to work already, the closer the ending of those projects are. And after that, of course, the mode of working, for example, as co-chairs will change a little bit, because we have to find a different way or a different time to do the work. But from the Fair Impact project, the recommendations will be the output to version 1, and then, as you can see from the timeline, the recommendations gathering is then the work that will continue from there. And then from the Fair Core for EOS, the metadata schema and crosswalk registry is maybe the most relevant output for this working group. So that's where those, for example, we can test and demo the recommendations for especially the technical recommendations for fair mappings, and also the exchange format specifications that we come up with. Any comments on the timeline or the timeline presentation or visualization? Does it make sense? Or can you? It doesn't make sense. Wim is shaking his head. Okay, good. So with that, I will give floor back to Jan and the status of the fair mapping recommendations.
Thank you, Jonas. So one thing that I would like to mention about the outputs of the working group. One of the main idea is that we are going to go through an iterative process, and we want to set up a process that will allow us to actually improve the quality of our outcomes even after the end of the working group, right? So, I mean, all the use case gathering and all the things is structuring a sort of simple process we can follow, a little bit like iAdopt did, to continue the work even if the working group mandate is gone, right? Because I think it's extremely valuable for many, 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 many communities. So we want to build useful resources, which is the point of the knowledge graph. Sorry, there is a mic that is distance. Is that okay? But gracias. So now I just want to give you a quick update. So I might not go into the details of this slide, so we keep time for discussions because I can spend 2 hours discussing about this. After spending 2.5 years on this, it's a bit normal. I just wanted to give you an update on fair impact recommendations. So basically the way we've been looking at this problem of how do you make mapping fair is both on the technical level with fair recommendations, what kind of technical recommendations we can give you to actually make them fair. The other aspect is what are the practical aspects that are underlying the process of mappings, right? And that you can use to actually integrate the verification steps in this process. So basically the idea is to come up with 2 types of documents and work and products. One is a document with formal recommendations. These recommendations should be then linked to technical implementation, because if we want to do fairness evaluation, at some point there needs to be some decisions made at the technical level. And I'll point some of the issues that actually for me are key. And then the practical framework, which is sort of a guidelines and process for communities that are actually taking starting the work of mappings. So the idea is to be a useful resource for them with a well-defined process of who is doing what, when, how, why. So the recommendations, there were different ways of working and defining the recommendations. Of course, what we want is the perfect alignment with the individual FAIR principles. However, that's going to be extremely boring because, well, you will have recommendations that overlap with principles because they come from different perspectives, but in the end, they have an impact on this particular principle. So the way we've been considering this is, rather than focusing on 15 different principles for which you will come up with that many recommendations, we thought it would be more interesting to group them by topics. So we identified 4 topics that aligns perfectly with we think perfectly, of course. It can be still a matter of debate with the FAIR principles. One is model and format, which is linked to interoperability. So everything that is FAIR vocabularies, the standards used to actually share and publish and serialize and so on and so forth. And of course, reusability, right? Because if you are using a particular format that no one uses, then no one can reuse, okay? There is the metadata aspect, which is the biggest aspect in the FAIR principles. That covers both findability and reusability as a whole. Then there is the PID aspect, or GUPRI, and you will hear this term from me. It's globally unique, persistent, resolvable identifier. It's not just a simple PID. It's like it has requirements there. And that is very important for findability and building search systems. And then services and API, right? And the idea is that you will work with mappings. These mappings need to use services like mapping registries that Jonas is developing. And I know Nico has been working on that on SESAM side. So the idea is that they need to align with some of the key requirements from FAIR on terms of accessibility, but also findability. So if you look at our categorization and clustering, you look that we don't have any gap on the different principles. So basically, with this method, we don't miss anything. We have a full coverage. And there are even places where you get overlaps between the topics. So model and format. Our first step with the work on fair impact was to start discussing and looking at what are the models that exist for mapping and sharing mapping and documenting mapping. The only real one that we found was SESAM, which comes from an initiative from the biomedical domain, where they started having a structure which could be serialized in TSV format, which is similar to the main format that is used by most of the communities. I mean, mappings, when you look at them, this is a correspondence table, 2 columns, terms in front of each other, no specification about the relation most of the time, which means that there is an assumption that says that it's same as, and sometimes it's a bit flaky. So the idea of SESAM is that these mappings should not stay in these 2 columns, but should be further increased in terms of documentation. So relation between the concepts should be formalized using existing relations like SCOS relation, exact match, broader than, narrower than, because they exist, they are standard, right? Even OWL could be used, same as, is a strong commitment in semantics, but still it's a relation we can use. And more importantly, they actually came up with a very nice metadata schema to document each of the mapping, because a mapping is done by someone, but if there's no explanation of why it chose to do that particular mapping, you are not able to reuse. If you don't have context, it's not reusable. So the idea of the work that we initiated in Fair Impact is not to redo anything, just reuse what exists and work with the initiatives. So we've been working with Nico, and the first recommendations we make is whenever you're doing simple mapping, just use SESAM. Don't think about something else. Use SESAM. It's simple, well documented. There are tools. There's a community that can support you. Just use it, right? And use that to share your mappings. So if you want to use XSLT internally in your system, that's fine. But then if you want to share it with others, you need to have a common language that is usable. So maybe there's transformation, and that's part of the work we want to do in this working group. Serialized mapping with linked data standards. Mappings are relations between concepts and even data elements and so on. So basically, it's well suited to the linked data approach, right? And use RDF whenever you can, or even JSON LD if you prefer JSON. And of course, use standards and FAIR vocabularies to structure the mapping metadata. It's already partially done in SESAM, actually it's done in SESAM, but you can use other if you want to add more metadata. So keep that in mind. So for instance, I need to look, I don't remember if there is an alignment between the collection metadata of SESAM and DCAT, right? So that might be some work that needs to be done. And the SESAM model is very simple. You have a header that contains the metadata, and this is the representation of your mapping and the associated metadata. So in the end, what is great with that format, it doesn't change the habits of the people doing the mapping. It's just ask them to provide more information in a more structured way and better documented. So that's why we chose to actually work with SESAM, so that SESAM could become a generic common exchange format for changing mapping. So we don't completely change the way you're working in your community, but we give you the key to actually share it with others so that it works. And the reason is we have been working on that, and that's going to be my second point. We have analyzed the metadata schema of SESAM based on the list of queries we gathered from many people in the group, and we ended up having for each of the queries a link to the metadata, which means that basically the metadata description is complete. However, there are limitations with SESAM. SESAM works fine for simple mappings and entity mappings, great. Now, I know Nico presented some of the work they are doing on complex mapping, where you need to map between different concepts or a different structure or pattern in another ontology. And that would happen also for metadata. Let's think about the one-to-many. In one metadata scheme, you get full name. In the other one, first name, last name. So these are two different mappings you need to do, but it's on the same thing. So the idea is to extend and work with SESOM to extend the model without transforming it dramatically, but just take the core model of the mapping, which is a triplet in the end, and see how we can modify the relations or take into consideration the different types of relations for data transformation, one-to-many, many-to-one, and so on and so forth. For the metadata, I already said everything. We tested it. We had the methodology in place. We have a paper. I forgot to put the link there. I'll share it with you. And basically, the idea is, even if you don't want to use SESOM, that's your call, right? Just look at their metadata and use their metadata to document your mapping. Because without documentation, what you're sharing is definitively useless for the others. And there's one thing that we need to work on is, in order to be fully fair, principle F3 says that you need to have a link to the PID that points to the mapping in the metadata record, right? So FAIR splits the metadata records and the data into two parts, and both have a PID, okay? Which is not yet there in SESOM. Therefore, we're moving to PIDs, right? So basically, if you think in terms of identifiers or globally unique persistent resolvable identifiers, so GUPRIs, to make it short, collection of mapping needs to have a GUPRI. That's a requirement for FAIR. Individual mappings must have a GUPRI. I mean, if you want to build another collection from mappings from different collections, you need them to be identified. Otherwise, you can't do that, right? So that's essential. You also need to have a GUPRI for the version. If the mapping changes over time, there needs to be an identifier that follows the version. So that needs to be discussed, right? Should it be on the identifier side, or should it be on the metadata side, right, where there's more freedom? And then, well, if whenever possible, again, that's the same spirit. It's a mapping, it's a link. So link data means, well, web-based URL, if you can, web-based PIDs, if you can. Of course, it is not discard the others. It's just say, like, if you are in the link data framework, use the link data framework. And so we started looking at how many PIDs or GUPRIs we need in a mapping. And in the end, a mapping outside of the metadata, it's all about GUPRIs. So you get a GUPRI for the mapping set. Actually, I forgot to mention there is a GUPRI for the metadata record of the mapping set, if you want to make it fair. There is a GUPRI that should be attributed to a mapping. The mapping itself is a series of 3 identifiers, one for the source, one for the target, and one for the relation, right, if it's properly done. So that's already 5, 6. There needs to be a PID or GUPRI attributed to the metadata record of each individual mappings. So just if you consider one mapping, that's 7 GUPRIs you need to manage, right? And then now you start thinking about 100,000 mappings. That's a lot of GUPRIs. And so one of the things we are actually considering related to the recommendation, it's nice to say do that, but then the question is to evaluate what would be the impact technically. Is it feasible, right? And definitely that many identifier that you need to resolve to get the metadata and so on, that is going to be a huge burden on infrastructure, because you need to make so many calls in order to work with the mappings that we might have to think very carefully on the type of technology we want to use, right? So web-based things would allow this, content negotiation would be great, but is it enough? Is it scalable? And there is an issue of scalability that came up in discussions. Service and API, so we came up with a lot of different recommendations. The idea is to give them to our friend, my friend Jonas, so that he can start implement them or putting it in the roadmap of FAIRcore for years. But the idea is FAIR principles are here for machine explainability, not for humans. Humans are going to be supported by the machine, so indirectly for humans. So you need to think also in terms of services that will help you work with the mappings, right? Access the mapping programmatically, it's major. So you need to have these services that stores the mapping, allow you to find them, to actually maybe comment them, contribute to a collaborative edition and so on. So this is for the part of the FAIR recommendations. We have been working on that. So the phrasing of the recommendation is not yet perfect. So we're working on making it better and clearer, looking at if we need to split some of the recommendation in sub-recommendations, providing a description of the recommendation so that it's understandable by everyone, and also starting looking at the technical implementations that it entails. So what kind of technology can you use to leverage that, right? And so we are hopefully will be able to deliver something by the end of the year. So that gives us some time to actually get your feedback and the feedback from other communities as well. Now, we've been also working on the side of practical things and community mapping practices. The idea was to discuss about mapping. And so basically asking the communities, what's your process when you do mappings? Do you curate them? You don't curate them? Is there a review process and this kind of things? And to try to bring these things together into a coherent framework, we actually have a survey still open. So if you are doing mappings, please answer the survey because that's going to be extremely useful. So we already have 24 answers to analyze, but the better the merrier so that we can make more informed decisions and we can also get back to you with this. And so we came up with this workflow that I will not go into the details, where basically we looked at the different stages you need to go through, the different stakeholders that needs to be involved, right? And the idea is now in the workshops we're organizing in Fair Impact that the communities comes and test to see whether or not it fits with their organizations and their way of working, if it can be improved, some of the things are not clear enough, and so on. And for supporting this work, we do have an Excel spreadsheet. So again, I mean, I've heard this comment like, oh, I'm doing my knowledge base in Excel, but that's how you start. Everybody starts the same. We do, right? So at some point, we might think about more machine actionable way, but that's actually a very useful and friendly way. And I stop there, right? So if you have any questions on this, please do not hesitate. I don't know if there are any questions online.
Perfect timing.
Thanks. I was feeling that I was talking too much, as usual. So if there's no questions, but still we have discussions. So these questions can come up later. That's a lot of information to digest. Maybe we can go there and we stop talking and then you start talking. So the idea is from this working group, really what we want is to generate something that's useful for all the people doing mappings. And that applies for governmental organizations, for scientists, for industry. There are really a lot of different use cases where mapping are necessary. So if we can come up at RDA with very useful resources that help all these people to actually do that in a more harmonized way with information they can gather, that would be great. And one of the information you need to gather is, I'm from that community, I want to do this kind of mapping. How do I do? And that's the key question you would ask as a user of that resource. So basically what you're looking for are use cases done by others. So you gain inspiration for actually implementing things your way. And you want it to have a relation to these use cases, the relations to the recommendations and implementation information that you have been used. So the motivation is that this harmonized use case collection is going to provide the foundations for all the other outputs in the working group, like the classification. If we have clear use cases that details the different types of mappings, they all call it mapping, that's fine. Then we work and we start thinking, okay, should we call that an entity mapping? I mean, for metadata schema, which are not ontologies, should we call that entity mapping? Or should it be metadata schema mapping, right? Because the idea is that when we talk about mapping, sometimes you're like, are we talking about the same thing? You're sure. So that's what we want to do. So it's clarifying this, proposing this for evaluation to the community. So it's going to be a continuous community feedback. The things about the data related mappings, working group has been working on API mappings as well. So how do we call them and how we clarify the definitions? And so in terms of collection of use case, we don't want to collect potential use cases, things that might be done in the future, at least in the first stage. We want to work with people that actually put their hands in the problem, have been working on this issue, come up to us with their use cases. right? So for instance, in many organizations, the mappings are hard-coded in the code. And that's why we want to get there. We want to tell them, maybe there is another way. If you express them in a common exchange format, then you can generalize your tool. And if you make a change in the mappings, you don't need to change the whole code, right? Because your code knows how to read the information and just runs the instruction. So maybe there is another way than just constantly having a request to the software engineer to actually update the code. You just update a table and then you get it working, right? So automating things. So that's why we really want to have this use case where either you are in there and doing it actively now, or that has been done. That's why we're also in contact with other working group. The metadata interest group and working group have been coming up with a lot of mappings. The scientific knowledge graph interest group, no, working group, I think, or interest group, they are mapping knowledge graphs together. They're generating tons of mappings, and there are other groups that might be interested in doing so. So we would like to collect all these so that we start harmonizing. And the first challenge is, how do we collect this information? Because we want that information coming from the communities to be useful for the classification, to be useful for defining an exchange model for a particular type of mapping, but also to be useful for evaluating the fair recommendations and the practical framework whenever we can. So that's a bit of a challenge. So we started working like the week before and the week before that. So 2 weeks before plenary, we called a meeting with the working group, all those who could make it, starting discussing what kind of information we would like to collect, start thinking about the structure and the process, but the process Jonas is going to talk about this. And the idea is to ease our analysis, because if we're collecting long list of text, that's a pain to analyze, especially if you start having large numbers of use cases, because you need to do the extractions from the text, and there's a lot of ambiguity and things. So we would like to reduce that as much as possible. Although now we have ChatGPT, we can just give them the thing and give me the summary, and we could do that. Although I don't want it to hallucinate on the data. And so we had these 2 working sessions. And so we came up with a list of questions, right? And so it starts with which domain you're doing the mapping. So it's interesting for us to see which scientific domains or even domains of activity for industry. I've been working with a colleague from the UN Stat Office. And so they are doing mappings between classifications for aggregating data from different sources so that they can make their statistics. So this is a typical use case. So we'd like to know where it's coming from. We would like to know the purpose of the mapping, right? So why do you do this? Do you do this for data transformation? Do you do that for data integration? Just semantic interoperability in search? And then how do you use the resulting mapping in practice? I mean, these mappings do not come out of the blue. They are integrated into an information system. And we would like to get some information, of course, anything that you can share with us on how you use them in practice in your information system, because that's going to be a very useful resource for anyone else wanting to do mappings. We want to know about the nature or type of map resource. Do you do mappings between 2 metadata schemas, 2 ontologies, 2 data sets, 2 tables, for instance, or between APIs, or between metadata and ontology, and so on and so forth. So we'd like to know this. And if possible, get the link to the existing mappings so we can actually have a look into the data and then start using that for the work. Of course, interesting things is what tools and methods you're using and the nature type of the mapping relation. So for instance, is it a unit conversion, right? So you just have a factor, multiplicatory factor between 2 different columns to make the transformation and so on. And finally, that's a bit more challenging, but we would like to ask the use case, the communities to provide us with examples that we could use. So look at their mappings, identify those that are slightly different. So they could come with a list of examples showing us, for instance, in a graph-based representation, 2 nodes of relation and the information of the relation, or pseudocode, or if it's being implemented hard-coded in the software, the code snippet that corresponds to one of the mappings. Or how do you do that? And any kind of representation we can use, right? because that will allow us to avoid going to the existing mappings and having to dig deeply into that to actually understand. And we believe that it's interesting for the community, because they'll have to think about the types of mapping they're doing. And so therefore, once we have this information, we can quickly start feeding this information to the group that is going to work on the exchange model, so that they can quickly come up with solutions for representing this. So this is how we structured the use case, and I'll leave Jonas to explain the process.
Thanks. So actually, I had one comment about the previous slide. So about the examples. So this is something that I've been doing in the Faircore for EOS project. So basically, looking at the code, looking at the XSLTs, looking at any kind of documentation, and trying to come up with mapping cases. So I'm not interested in the content itself or what is being mapped, but the kind of different scenarios for mappings that you have, and that's the idea of the last thing. So if you just have one-to-one mappings, one sample is enough. It's to explain all the variation in the different mapping cases. Yes, so we have for the implementation of the data collection, we are following the path of the iAdopt working group. So we are using GitHub issues as the primary collection method, and because it's really nice that it's publicly available, and you have the discussion publicly available, and all the tools are there. I want to show you. I want to show you a couple of things that we have set up. So this is based on after the working meetings that we've had. Let me get this out of the way. There has been some development already in the issues before we had any kind of structure in place. And this is kind of like the example that Jan was talking about, that if you don't have any structure, so this is not to put the person who added this into the spotlight.
Just mention, where is this?
Yes. Stored? Yeah, that's actually the next thing that I was about to say. But so this is so we are now we have set up the Fair Mappings Working Group GitHub repository under the Mapping Commons organization. So Mapping Commons has some unrelated tools. So we think it's a nice, good place to be. No worries. So Jesper did very nice job of adding two cases or use cases here already, and here's a short one. This is something that you could actually pretty easily maybe sort out, but then the semantic transformation is a bit more complicated thing, and going through this kind of documentation, it takes time, but this is also, I mean, a very good example about how the word mapping is used. So in the text there are mapping functions and mapped to ontological concepts. So what is the difference between a mapping function and just a function or other kind of functions? And also I think this is it's really nice that there's an image, and this is something that we're hoping to support or that will be supported in the template too. Based on the Fair Mappings use case collection template that Jan just explained, there is a very simple version now of the issue template that has all of those things. I'm trying out a thing that might work or might not work. So for example, for the purpose of the mapping, there's two ways of inputting that. So you either can select from a drop down, or you can put something else in. So The idea here would be that while the data is being accumulated, maybe the kind of like the vocabulary related to these pair mappings and the purpose of the pair mappings could be then extended, and in the end there would be rare cases where you would have to put in the other purpose, and you would be able to find something from the drop down that fits your case. So one question is this a good way to do it, and should we implement something like this for the other fields in the form, because there are now just text fields. But that's the kind of like the starting point. And the nice thing also about this is that there's an API, and you can get the data, and you can work on it even if there is a lot of issues. And finally, the idea is that when we have gone through the issues and we have labeled them with a specific label, then these issues will be turned into MK docs documentation that will then pop up here in the GitHub IO pages. So this would be the first part of the knowledge base, if you will. So basically a list of curated list of use cases, not pair mappings, but mapping use cases that has specific structure of describing them. And we realized that not everybody might have GitHub account or might not even want to get one. They don't want to do it. So we have set up a secondary way of submitting the same information. So you can use the Google Forms. And the idea here is that we would be, after looking at it, that it's not something completely different, this data would be copied into an issue. So in the end, it would become part of the issue collection, and it will be then subject to the public eye and the public commenting. So that's something to keep in mind if you are using this. Yeah.
So Barbara is asking if these use case descriptions are there themselves. That's a very good question. Right now, no. I mean,
yeah. No.
Yeah, maybe
yeah.
Barbara.
Yeah, go ahead, Barbara.
Ask Barbara to ask the question.
Oh yeah, so Barbara, please ask the question that you had in the chat.
Okay, I can ask. I understood that this is pattern of the knowledge base, so your use case collections.
Yep.
So, but these are a PDF at the end plus an identifier, probably.
Yep.
But we could make them fair as well, very easily.
Yeah.
And I can work on it if you want. I can help you. So I just say we are working with this type of making everything also fair. So that's part of the knowledge graph if you want.
That would probably involve nano applications. Would that
yeah, probably. Yes.
I hazard a guess, yes. But I think that's a good idea. So as I said, this is kind of like the first iteration of what would become the knowledge base for mappings, and I think it's a good idea to make these also as fair as possible. So
anyway, I'm not imposing it,
your footsteps.
Proposing.
Sorry?
I'm not imposing it or so. I just propose and I can help. Also, I can do something for it, for the group, and I want to be active anyway. So
definitely. I mean, I want to learn how the nano applications work. So there's common interest or there. So yes, we should talk. Okay, so that's the status and what we have. So I will go back to the information collected. So if you have any comments about this and for example the what is in here, is there something missing? if there are, for example, if some of these should be or could be lists or vocabularies now or later. Go on.
I am pretty sure that you have thought about that. Indeed, I ask a question because it's something that is typically a hard problem in other démarches, similar démarches. And particularly for fair mapping, I think it could be really important to ask some information collected on provenance aspects on a format that is strong, just because the process of formatting the mapping and all the actions that are done to map can determine the final result. And if you want to reproduce this kind of process, it is often very difficult, in my point of view. But after, I don't know how to mitigate between to be too much complicated and how to be sure to catch very important things.
How would you describe that kind of information?
Yeah, for instance, you know what is provenance, an activity, an agent, and the action that was performed by the agent on the entity. And often, when you have a mapping, you don't have only one agent. You have several agents to participate to the action of mapping. And behind that, there is an aspect that is a bit difficult to catch, but it's open questions. Indeed, I know that we will work on that. And for instance, governance aspects are critical.
Yeah, I think this is a good point. And there was something, or as we have been discussing the last bullet point there, at one point it was more about the kind of something related to what you said. So what kind of, for example, external information is needed in order to do the mapping? So kind of like workflow and different operations that you do to get from the maybe multiple different sources of data into the mapping. So, but that went away. So that's maybe something that would at least answer some of the provenance issues. But I think there the difficulty is how to ask it in a way that it's possible to answer it in a nice way.
I think it's great. So what you're mentioning is we need to get from the use cases the process description. Say who's done what and how the mapping has been generated. So that's why we have the tool methods. Maybe we can reshape the questions, the tool methods and process used, and then maybe make a reference to the practical framework where they could provide us some similar representation. It doesn't have to be the same workflow, but you know, boxes, arrows, list of people involved and who and where they were involved. That's enough. So that gives us a description of this. However, we are not intending to use directly this information in the work of the working group. And not all the communities have actually a process. The process is I put 10 people in the room, they get the mapping done and see you. I mean, I'm thinking without being negative. I mean, for instance, I've been asking that to my colleagues from CodeMeta. I know Moran is here. That's a bit, they have a conference or they have a group, a work session. They define the mappings and that's it. So it's not like it's a formalized process where it's a review and so on. So that's certainly going to be updated at some point, but the initial process is very simple. And sometimes in the community, it's two guys in the room that knows about metadata and ontology that argue together for hours on how you do mappings. And at some point they converge because one of them is drunk or whatever. And then poof, it's published, right? So, I mean, it can be extremely hands-on and things and not necessarily structured. So we will have definitively a lot of variability in the answers.
Yeah, indeed, Jan, you know that I want to be involved also in the démarche. So my purpose is also linked to another activities that I have. But when we work on reusability, for instance, at the level of research infrastructure, one big issue that we have, and it could be the same for pair mapping, is the quality level of what is in and how it is described in the model. So provenance is one aspect of this quality level. Perhaps there are others to be perhaps proposed not as a mandatory concept, but also additional concepts that could help to increase the level of mapping when they are only, on my sense, when they are only done by two persons in a room, that's often can be duplicated in several rooms in the same time, and we have mapping to do between mappings and things like that.
Yeah, so there I would say it depends on the use case. I mean, mappings are coming up from a need. There is a need, let's say at dance, they are not going to call an RDA group to actually get the mappings they need at dance. So basically there's Vim and someone else that's going to sit at the table, define a pre-mapping and then share it. Now the value is if you share them in a fair way, things that are missing are going to be accessible to the rest of the community. So you could have community curation, right? So Vim.
Yeah, thanks. So I agree that this aspect of provenance is quite important, but in practical terms, we should maybe in this working group and in the information model externalize it so that you essentially say people can publish their process that they follow to derive this mapping, because realistically it's going to apply for all 25 mappings in your one metadata schema to another effort. So you can reuse that reference and say, go read there if you want to see how we came to this mapping. Because I think it is a bridge too far in terms of what people can do realistically in a working day to record that fine-grained provenance for each mapping.
Thank you, Vim. I think that's part of the work we need to do. And if you want to make things fair, the FAIR principles on data said provide rich metadata. Dot. So what's rich metadata, right? What's the granular? Yeah, it can be, as I said, it's from one metadata elements to an infinity of metadata elements. So at some point, that's what we need to discuss within the communities. What would be the minimum useful information in terms of provenance and things like that? And at least if you get a contact point to the guy, he can explain you the process if you really need that provenance information with high granularity. And I saw that Nico also had the comments that there is a ticket in SESAM to actually how to work with prov and align SESAM, although there are some provenance information in SESAM metadata. But it's key, I agree. So, yeah, sorry.
Hey there. Where should I hold the mic for the online people?
Yeah.
Closer?
He's loud, so he doesn't have to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your session on this important topic. It's a little bit outside of my area. I'm a social scientist, and so the technical stuff is not my expertise. But especially because of the topic this morning on environmental data, and because you're talking about FAIR principles, I was wondering if you've investigated at all the CARE principles and how that might apply here. So the CARE principles being developed by the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, to have collective ownership and collective benefit and different Indigenous rights respected. And with mapping, I know that there has been concern in other contexts around geographic information and mapping of Indigenous territories. It might be outside of the remit here, but I was just curious if that's come up at all in your conversations and if you'd be interested in exploring it. Thanks.
So I'll answer while I'm moving to John. So it's a very good point. So we haven't formally talked about the CARE principles, but the idea of making this mapping fair is that this is a very expensive resource. And just getting in Eden somewhere in an information system in some places you can't reuse, it's a waste of money and resources. So that's why we think that, at least I think, that the first things to do is to actually make them fair. And then there will be the community and the collaborative framework that is going to appear so that you can actually implement the CARE FAIR, some of the CARE principles. But we have been only focusing on FAIR. That doesn't mean that we're not listening to the others. There's also the JUST principles that are coming. So
Okay, thank you. So, sorry for all the clicking you heard online. I just wanted to mention, I think this may be an opportunistic time. If you're interested, they are defining, correct me if I misunderstood, the metadata that needs to be used to describe a mapping. Where would you put information about how this mapping is or is not fair? You'd put it in the metadata for the mapping. So if the community is, I think I would defer this in a way to the community, redirect it to the community that is trying to promote the the CARE principles, and say, can you give us a set of definitions of descriptions of an asset that indicate in what way it is, in fact, meeting the principles? And then people who are actually creating the mappings can show how they satisfied that.
Are you interested in kind of a dialogue here? Can I respond to that? I am not Indigenous, but I've been following the CARE principles closely. And one thing that comes to mind as a metadata is like, whose traditional territories does the map capture? And a platform like Native Land does a really good job of all you have to input is a postal code or longitude, latitude, and it'll tell you the Indigenous peoples who are stewards of the land. So that could be something that could be included in the metadata. And then in sharing that information, maybe it's a, many nations have research offices, right? So maybe it's just a contact of, we have this information, like, do you want it? Like more of a targeted share rather than just making it open and findable. But I don't.
Sorry, so Tim.
Yeah, so I agree that one has to have a look at maybe whether CARE principles are applicable, but I'm personally doubtful because what we are describing in these mappings is more like software configurations. So it's about the process and not the content. Our descriptions are agnostic of the content.
I was talking about.
Yeah.
Extended world, it's way beyond that, right? It's describing things that are mapped to each other. It's describing communities that are mapped to each other. It's describing all sorts of concepts, many of which have care issues associated with them. And so for that community, being able to say with the mapping, we're mapping things that actually have impact on care. Sorry, you could say that in my.
Yeah, so let me.
No, but so.
No. I mean, maybe maybe in the first instance, what John was saying that some of the mappings, being able to identify whether a mapping has an impact could have implication for care might be sufficient. So in that, when you collect the information, if you ask the people who are going to enter the information, could that, is it relevant? Has it got some relevance to care principles? If it's just initially just a tick box, without going too much into detail, and then afterwards working with the care principle people, and then, trying to dig out a little bit more, I think would be a first step.
Yeah, that's definitely something we could add. And along the same lines, I started thinking that although like the idea here is not to collect use cases about pair mappings, but just mappings. But I was thinking that based on the discussion that it might be good idea to have a way to describe if you think or if you know that your mappings are fair. So you could describe it the ways that you are already doing that.
I think you have that in mind, but could you give some example of use case you have already detected?
We haven't detected use case. UNAS has some use cases to build FAIRCORE for risk. We do have some in fair impacts, but within the group, there are tons of use cases. Like you've seen Jesper just put 2 use cases in during the meeting, right? Or just before the meeting. So there are a lot. So we don't target any. The same thing, we had these discussions because mapping is often used as entity mapping, so concept to concept mappings, which is great. But I don't believe we should restrict ourselves to semantics, because actually mappings are used in ETL systems and many other systems. So, and there are people asking for more on the mappings, so we want to keep it broad. So no restrictions on the use case, as long as you already made mappings that you want to share with us and explain. That's the only restriction.
Yeah, but for example, in the FairCore for EOS project, the idea is that use the case studies that have cases that relate to mappings. And what I think we should do is to use the use case collection and add those use cases there. And for example, related to the fair, how these mappings are fair. So as Jan mentioned, we are trying to implement the kind of at least the technical fair mappings principles in the FairCore in the metadata schema and crosswalk registry. So what you could put there then is that the mappings are there, and they have a PID, and each individual mapping has a PID, and you can get them out in SESOM format, and you can add new versions with the SESOM format and things like that. That's what you could then in the end put to this, if there would be a place there for describing how your mappings are already fair.
So also in the process, right? So we know it's incomplete. We know we need some kind of information, but it's not because you ask a question, you get the right answer. So we don't really know what we will get from the people who describes the use cases. Even if the question seems clear to us, sometimes you will have a misunderstanding, or that's called human semantic interoperability problem. That's what we usually do by talking. So in any case, what we would like to collect, and that's why we use GitHub, is that through GitHub, we can ask directly the questions to the person who actually submitted the use case for refinement. Also, the Google form will ask for at least contact information so that we can iteratively work and curate the thing. And while we're receiving more use cases, we'll refine the questions. Now, that's also why we started with the Google form. It's not only because people do not have GitHub accounts. Most of the people who are doing mapping, they are technicians. Of course, they use GitHub. Most of them, they are already involved in developing information systems. So in a way or another, they have to access GitHub to look at what their colleagues are doing and so on. So they have an account and they know how to use it more or less. So submitting an issue with a template is kind of straightforward. Now, the main issue is if we start doing this and we structure the issue in a way, but we change completely after that, I'm afraid that, in GitHub, you will have a struggle to migrate from one format to the other later on. Well, if you have a spreadsheet, basically you don't care if you change the spreadsheet, you reallocate the columns. And the good thing is you can go from the spreadsheet to the template automatically, because you can write a piece of code that does that and then generates your GitHub issues automatically. So there is some value, but I think now what we would need to do is to actually go through this iterative process while we're waiting for endorsement so that we start testing and benchmarking. That's also what we would like from you, is like, okay, you have a use case that you know or you are involved in, please fill in the use case template and let us know what is missing, what is not clear. And we'll look at the data when you have done that so that we can come back to you and say, this is not what I meant, or this is nice, but I'm missing this information that will be useful for the classification or for the thing. So of course, I mean, if you have any open suggestions, we are all ears, right? So that's the point.
And those should be put to the Google Doc.
Yeah.
So yes.
We have seen the agenda. We have seen the Google form. We know that we can subscribe to the group as a first step, and the Google Doc as a Google form as a second step. How will you organize the work during the next steps that you have presented between peoples? What are the tasks that you want to propose to us?
So as you've seen in the timeline, so the first step is use case collection. So we need to get it right. at least a good version we can work with. So that's where I will need help of people for, well, first getting the use case in, then analyzing the use cases to see what is a bit flaky, shaky that we, or what is going to take time also in the analysis, right? I was joking, but maybe at some point we'll end up doing this and feeding it to ChatGPT so we can summarize. Because if you get use cases like several pages long, you don't want to analyze a paper for a use case. That's a lot of work. And look at what are the pain points in the process, right? Because you have to keep in mind that the idea is that we are laying out the foundation for the working group forever. Because I think the group can stay very long, because you can always add new use cases, new types and things like that as we come along. So beyond month 18 of the working group. So if we start identifying the pain points in the process of analysis, that's going to be useful, because then we can establish this process on the long run, knowing that the collection and the analysis is going to happen during the 18 months. Because we're going to talk to people like, oh yes, I can provide you a use case. And then you have a new use case. And the idea is we work, of course, on the first sets of use cases to come up with the first version of the classification, the first version of the harmonized collection, the first version of the models, if there are already models that come out of this. And then we continue working on it. And in terms of organization of the work, if I may, so the plan is to, and here I'm going to make the call to, we need more co-chairs. So, because we would like to organize the work, so at least I think we agree on the bi-weekly. Yeah, so we'll have a bi-weekly. Now, we understand that having a bi-weekly that covers 3 continents, it means it's a pain in the butt for Europeans, but also Australians and so on. So what we would love to achieve, but we need to find, and if there are volunteers or people interested, we might have someone in the US. I need to get back to him, see if he's still available. But the idea would be that we organize continent groups, right? So they each work independently, in a sense. All the information is fed back into the shared folder, and so you will be able to see what they've done. And then we meet every 2 months maybe to synchronize if there is real need of synchronization. So we avoid having this burden of having a meeting at midnight, at least for Europeans, or 6 a.m. in the morning for Australians, right? That's a lot of just.
Yeah, just one comment about what Jan was saying about the using the ChatGPT type of field. There's a comment from Nico or a task suggestion for anyone interested from Nico that we could use. There was a tool called OntoGPT. There's a link in the chat that we could take the structure that we have defined and try to see if we can extract use cases from literature using that and the tool. So apparently a Saturday nice project if somebody wants to take up on that. I might.
I don't hear you, Jan.
He's reiterating the comments from Nico.
I'm a little confused about the use cases, whether they should, if I have something where I'm already doing mappings, but they're not fair and they're not using SESAM, is that the kind of use case you want to hear? Because the online description implies to me my mapping should already be fair. So
that's an excellent comment. So no, so they don't, the idea is that nothing needs to be fair. The idea is that it's just a mapping, that's enough. But I think then what you can, if you have a use case there and what you can get from the work being done in the working group is that you can come up with the ways of making them fair in the end or at some point, because that's, yeah, so. So which text were you referring to?
Top of the ticket started.
Excellent, yes. So the top of the ticket description should be revised.
So the idea is the use case is the entry point. So we are going to use internally this for our work, but the idea is that leads. Well, you should start looking at the recommendations to see what you need to do in order to make them fair, right? So it's also part of the process. And that's why we included that into the RDA working group, because that's going also to be an iterative process. We'll make some proposition, but maybe in practice, that proposition is just a nightmare for all the people doing mappings. So we might have to revise the things. Barbara, you want to talk?
Yes. So I know you had already 2 meetings, right? And you will have additional ones, because with this GitHub issues, I can just propose use cases, but I would like also to propose a little bit more other things that are not use cases, and I don't know exactly where to put them, this information, or should I then come to the meetings? Is that
Yes,
the idea?
so where to put them? Well, there are a couple of these shared documents that if it relates to those, for example, you can edit or comment those. And actually, we are running out of, or coming to the end of the session. So there is going to be, so the next group activity that will be organized is the roundtable meeting, and the idea.
Yeah, but that's just between the chairs.
Yeah. So so the downside there is so this is something we have planning. So this is for the RDA co-chairs of the related working group. So that's one way of participating next. But of course, these organized working sessions is there also. So if you have something that doesn't fit into the existing or started work, that's one way of contributing, of course. And
so I am willing to do probably or work with the European continent, co-chair or somehow help here.
Sorry, I didn't understand what you were saying.
Yeah, there was the question, who is willing to be a volunteer for organizing or helping in different continent parts or whatever.
Yeah, but we would rather work with someone in the continent, because that means also that the person has the contact and the network locally and can work.
Yeah, but I live in Europe. Is that a continent? Sorry.
You live where? Sorry?
In Europe?
Oh, you can. Oh, yeah. So of course you can contribute to organize meetings in Europe. I mean, you're all welcome. The thing is, what we need to define, and there will be email sent around, is we should have a sort of regular meeting slot, and we haven't yet defined it. So we use the ad hoc meetings based on Doodle, but we should have a regular meeting to discuss the work. And of course, we'll start documenting more the Fair Mapping Working Group page on RDA website, so that you can have access to all the places where you can contribute for use case deposition, comments, all the documents. Everything is transparent, of course, right? So, but I agree, we need to give you the right information. One thing that we should also consider is the how we talk together, not necessarily through emails, because emails things are going to be lost, because we receive already tons. So I think, Barbara, you proposed to use Mattermost, right?
Yes.
So we need to set this
a lot
up.
with Mattermost. Works quite well.
Mattermost. Sorry. Yes. Well, we use Slack, so it's a version of Slack. It's a substitute of Slack. We could use Slack. No. So we still need to get organized. One thing that is funny, actually, is not everyone is registered on the Fair Mapping Working Group list, because not everybody signed up to the working group on RDA website, which means that Lise and we together, Eunice, Lise and I, were working on copying and pasting a list of mails from an Excel spreadsheet with 190 mails, and we don't have therefore the common mailing list. So please, if you want to contribute, register to the Fair Mapping Working Group page and become a member. Therefore, you'll get all the info in one go with the Fair Mapping mailing lists. So again, also something that we discussed with that Eunice was mentioning in the next steps. So what it's been required by the TAB that we start in thinking how we can work together with the other interest group and working group. So what we would like to do before the end of the year is to have a sort of synchronization / discussion meetings with the different interest group that we identified to see how we can coordinate the work. I know that many of the group are represented as a member, like the contributors, but we need to see how things works in practice and where you can get the information on existing mappings. So that's something that is, of course, on our hands. We'll also share with you the updates on the charter when we're finished with Eunice. Charter is online, so if you have other comments, you would like to change things or add things, just please contribute to the Google Doc. And of course, you can always contact us by email, Eunice and myself. We'll be happy to get back to you. And if you know, yeah, me too. So it's just like there's so many, so way too many. But I think it's time for us to say muchas gracias todos. Thank you all for contributing to that session. It's really lovely. And we'll continue having other working group meetings, and I hope with the same energy. So thank you all for contributing and participating to the discussion. It was very useful.